After our hands-on with the Street Fighter 6 demo, it's clear there's still plenty left to say about the final release. Street Fighter 6 is a gargantuan project from Capcom after all. It's a game in 3 parts, between the World Tour adventure, the Battle Hub online lobbies, and lastly, the classic 1v1 battling of the fighting ground. It all combines to create a truly feature-complete game at launch, and it's all here on day one. Now, if you're looking for comparison and performance testing between PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X, S, and last gen, I'll be summarizing it briefly today, but I will say the demo I tested a few weeks back was an honest slice of what you'll be getting. So honest, in fact, not much has really changed between the demo and the final build in terms of its tech, for better and worse. But more on that in a moment. The bigger question for today though, one I'm often asked about in the comments, is about latency. For such a competition-focused title, which version hands in the lowest latency controls, the most responsive input, and of course, what's the best way to set up the game, focusing in particular on its input delay reduction mode? Let's find out. Okay, so how does the final game look and run? Starting at the top, both PS5 and Series X run with a 3840x2160 target, a full 4K resolution at 60 frames per second, and both deliver all the bells and whistles. Visually speaking, they are a feature match. We get crisp textures, screen space reflections in every mode, and even Capcom's muscle deformation tech as characters deliver their finishing moves. Both also run at a fluid 60 frames per second in the arcade mode. Absolutely zero problems for the classic 1v1 action. However, the World Tour mode doesn't run well on its default settings on PS5 or Series X. This free-roaming adventure is kind of a Yakuza light, as you take on missions and challenge opponents on the street, but just as with the demo, engaging in 1v1 battles triggers a 30 FPS cap. It's an unevenly frame-paced 30 FPS as well, and feels unresponsive to control as a result. The fix? Go to the options menu and switch over to the performance mode instead. This mode change only affects the World Tour gameplay, and forces the resolution down to 1440p, rather than the 4K used for the rest of the package. And yes, 60 FPS is restored on both PS5 and Series X this way. No question, it plays a lot better, and I will stress that the regular fighting ground mode, the traditional 1v1 battles, still run at 4K and 60 FPS even with the performance mode selected. Next along is Xbox Series S. Series S users will be glad to hear the game does run well at 60 FPS, even if the visual cutbacks to get there run surprisingly deep. For a start, whether it's the arcade mode or the World Tour mode, the game renders at a native 1920x1080. Impressively, that 1080p resolution gets us to 60 FPS in the World Tour mode, even during its 1v1 battles on the street. There isn't a resolution or performance mode toggle on Series S, but at least Capcom does give us a 60 FPS optimized way to play the game right out of the box. Mostly anyway. Expect more drops and more hitches below 60 as you sprint through the open environments on Series S, but for the most part, it's pretty solid based on my time around the Chinatown area and the central Metro City district. Also, crucially, the arcade mode portion of the package is a watertight 60 FPS too, so you're at no competitive disadvantage on Series S in terms of its mechanics, even if, yes, image quality and visual features are stripped back compared to PS5 and Series X, but more on that in a moment. Last up, of course, is the last-gen situation. Now, there is no last-gen Xbox One or One X version of Street Fighter 6, but Capcom does still insist on PS4 and PS4 Pro support. And both run really well too, so long as you only care about the classic arcade mode. Any traditional 1v1 gameplay in the fighting ground segment is a pure 60 FPS experience with zero compromise on performance, just as it should be. And to prove the point, there's even online crossplay with Series X, PS5 and PC, where both PS4 and PS4 Pro are more than up to holding their own. I mean, sure, there are visual cutbacks, starting with the drop to a native 1080p on base PS4. And as for the PS4 Pro release, it guns for a more ambitious 1440p, which is oddly enough higher than even Series S while still maintaining 60 FPS. Now, the catch to all of this, well, it's the World Tour mode. Sadly, on last gen, this mode's frame rate is a bit all over the place. On base PS4, for example, it's an unlocked wavering 40 to 60 FPS while exploring the Metro City area, and then in battle, you're forced into a capped 30 FPS experience with no way to toggle out of it. The way World Tour mode runs is easily the biggest drawback to playing on last gen, and even PS4 Pro doesn't solve it, where again here we have an unlocked 40 to 60 FPS range, with battles again capping to 30. That's the rundown then. I will say dynamic resolution scaling is possible on all consoles, and there is some evidence of a checkerboard pattern on PS5 and Series X's 4K output, but the resolutions appear fixed in place based on most tests. It's also worth saying that, sadly, every issue I had with the World Tour mode demo stays in this final release. The low quality textures, the NPC pop-in, the half-refresh NPCs at range, and the low quality screen space reflections, it's all still here at launch, even on PS5 and Series X. And worse still, on PS4 and PS4 Pro, there's also a really glaring texture streaming bug. Really, this all sticks out given the obvious quality of Street Fighter VI's traditional 1v1 fighting modes. The gorgeous detailing of its main roster, like Ryu, Chun-Li, the material choice on the clothes, and the lighting, it's all just beautifully presented. World Tour mode lacks that same level of polish, I'm afraid to say, and almost feels like a different game. Now, the third pillar of Street Fighter VI is of course the Battle Hub. Wedged in between the Fighting Ground and World Tour modes, this is a virtual lobby of sorts. A room filled with kiosks, arcade cabinets, where players are able to interact with each other's avatars. It suffers from the same SSR disocclusion issues as the World Tour mode. Performance is also a little shy of a 100% lock on 60 FPS on Series X and PS5 at times, but still, it's a fun extra. And it even makes it possible to play on old Street Fighter II, Mega Man, and Final Fight cabinets here. Before we jump to the latency chat, a quick word on the visual cutbacks on Series S in particular. With a direct comparison with Series X using replays, which wasn't possible in the demo, the RE engine scales back a lot of detail to make 60 FPS viable on this smaller 4 teraflop machine. It's 1080p on left versus 4K on right of course, but I think the more distracting issue is the textures and the presentation of fine details like hair. Series S has, alas, the distinction of having the worst quality textures of any console release, including even PS4 and PS4 Pro. Materials on characters, the skin, the clothing, all rendered with low resolution assets, and it's not simply the drop to 1080p causing it either, it's the content itself, the assets, especially viewing all these characters up close. Pair that with the obvious dithering artifacts on hair, like Manon's flowing locks, and it's a pretty disappointing turnout. Note how even in this side-on gameplay view, these hair elements become a noisy mess of pixels, and even the game's TAA method struggles to resolve it into a clean result. A few more points for Series S here. On the plus side, Series S keeps physics-based decoration like the cherry blossoms, which move around characters' feet on the Genbu stage, but Series S still takes some other big cuts. Notably, and I've mentioned this on my Twitter feed, the muscle deformation text shown during finishing moves on PS5 and Series X is removed outright on Series S. In comparison then, see how Ryu's arm is missing those popping veins, and those muscle tendons no longer flex under the skin layer. On top of the low quality texture work, Series S is really missing a neat visual flourish from the Series X release. And along the same lines, we also have removed background details on most stages on Series S. Switching between the two, Series S and Series X, you'll spot huge crowds of background characters are stripped out completely. Likewise, shadows are removed and even elements of lighting go missing at points. Honestly, most of these things aren't noticeable in action on Series S, it's all about how the game plays at the end of the day of course, but I will say the low quality textures and the hair artifacts do stick out. Lastly then, let's turn to base PS4 with the same replay method, making it possible to compare to PS5. All of the compromises on Series S apply here of course, however, base PS4 strips a few extra details out over the top. Screen space reflections, for example, are removed from water in the arcade mode battles on base PS4, so that means no SSR at all on the Genbu Temple stage, and likewise, the ambient occlusion shading is significantly dialed down. That said, SSR is still engaged on PS4 Pro on a low preset, which ends up running at the same quality as Series S. Next along, the physics-based elements like cherry blossoms are now static. On PS4 and PS4 Pro, there's zero movement on the ground, making it a current-gen feature only. There's a myriad of other small changes in shadows and texture filtering, but on the plus side, base PS4 and by extension PS4 Pro surprisingly use high-quality textures compared to Series S. So let's switch to a comparison between base PS4 versus Series S here, and notice how on character models, in comparison directly, there's a clear advantage on the older system. These two machines even run at the same 1080p resolution, though obviously PS4 misses out on plenty of other features in SSR, physics-based elements, and ambient occlusion too. But still, it's a very odd turnout for the textures. Perhaps one of the biggest questions I've had about Street Fighter 6 or any 2D fighter in our coverage relates to its input latency. That is, the time it takes for your controller or stick to make an input and then see an on-screen response. Just how fast, how responsive is the RE engine? Especially bearing in mind fighting games weren't really its original focus. Well, to talk about it, I've actually invited a specialist in testing latency, Nigel Woodall. Welcome.
Hi there. Thanks for getting me along.
Absolutely, it's absolutely great to have you on. Where to start? I guess for Street Fighter 6, the latency results are already out on your Twitter feed. It's great to hear from you directly though, of course, and to give your thoughts and present them. And if people are interested, they can find you on Twitter at @Noodles. But I guess the first question to ask is, what is the most responsive way to play the game between all consoles and PC, and how would you adjust the game's settings to give the best results?
Sure. So we got a bit of an early head start on this with the demo that came out before. So kind of been testing through for a couple of weeks now, but with the full release, we're happy enough to see that it's pretty consistent across the newer formats. So the PlayStation 5, the Xbox Series S and the Xbox Series X, and even the PC have pretty similar results. So I've got a kind of testing method that I've applied to this. We've managed to do about 500 tests for each one of these, and they're all coming out at about 58 milliseconds or so. There's a bit of variation, but I think it's probably within the margin of error. It's good to see that the Xbox and the PlayStation 5 are, neck and neck. Surprisingly, the Xbox Series S actually came out a touch ahead, but I think it's probably more just the testing than anything. I'm not going to put my hat on that being the clear winner. PC version came out very similar as well. My gut feeling is there's probably some settings or something there, maybe even tinkering in the INI files or something like that would get it ahead. My system at home is a 3080, so I'd be surprised if it's exactly the same as the other ones. Like when we ran the demo through its paces, we tried to change as much as we could, and it didn't really seem to have a large impact on the results. I kind of wonder if there's something kind of holding it back a little bit, but for now it looks to be the same.
So I guess the bottom line there is it's all pretty competitive. If you're playing online, there's not really a huge advantage in terms of the hardware as far as the current gen consoles and PC go, but there's kind of a twist to this on the older last gen PS4 versions, right?
Yeah, so I think unfortunately they have fallen behind a little bit. So having a look at the older ones, you can play the PlayStation 4 version on the PlayStation 5, and that comes out at about 63 milliseconds or so. We got results of kind of 70 and 71 milliseconds for the PlayStation 4 Pro and the PlayStation 4, the original version there. So a fair bit behind, I guess, where the PS5 can get to.
Yeah, so that's about 14, 13 millisecond difference compared to what we had on PS5. I don't know how significant that would be in practice, but it's maybe something to bear in mind if you're a really hardcore Street Fighter fan, where every millisecond counts, every frame counts.
I think that's it. If you're looking to get the most out of it, it's good to see for this one, the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series S and X are right up there.
So with all that in mind, obviously Capcom's kind of taken to heart the needs of the fighting community, the competitive side, and added in a few extra options on console editions as well, which we're seeing more of this generation, especially in regards to 120Hz support. But they've got a low latency mode mode. So, on that note, is there a kind of optimal way to play the game between that and the quality and performance modes as well?
So we found the input delay reduction mode really does make a pretty big difference. Really does make a fairly big reduction in that input lag there. I think I've seen as high as 92 milliseconds or so for a no input delay reduction on a PS4. The graphics and performance settings don't seem to have any great impact in the fighting modes. It seems that that's more of a world tour setting.
I guess looking at the game more generally, Street Fighter 6 is obviously based on a new engine tech. Capcom's got a tradition, it seems, of jumping between technologies between each game as of late. Street Fighter 6, RE Engine, Street Fighter 5, Unreal Engine, and then a custom in-house engine for Street Fighter 4, I believe. Did you get any kind of results on how much that's changed the way the game plays and how responsive the game is between each?
Yep, so actually I took the chance to go back. I had a look at Street Fighter 5. This one actually within the community got quite a bit of criticism at launch. And they did go back and they put quite a bit of work into it, and it's good to see that they're continuing on with that. So having a look at it now and its latest patch version, coming out at about 80 milliseconds or so. So a bit behind the Street Fighter 6, but still, not terrible. So Ultra Street Fighter 4 running PS4 version on PS5 came out at 67 milliseconds. So again, just a little bit behind where Street Fighter 6 has got to.
That's great news, though, because it means that what we've got now is the most responsive incarnation of the game to date, barring maybe what we had in the, Street Fighter 3 and before days where we had, CRTs to help as well.
I think everyone's happy that they're paying attention to it and they've really launched in the right way. I
guess the other question to ask is, of course, you're using a standardized input for all of these consoles just to make it kind of a standardized test. Do you want to talk a little bit on that? We're not using a DualSense controller or the standard Xbox controller in this case, are we?
That's right. I use it's a Brook is I think a Taiwanese company that creates very rapid fighting kind of PCBs that you can use. Because it's the same PCB across multiple systems, it just kind of takes one of the variables away, and then it means that there's only so many moving parts that get changed test from test. The way I do it, I kind of have, so for this one I've used a camera setup. With the new consoles with 4K, 120 and so forth, I hear that they've got capture cards that are about to come out, but I just can't apply the old way that I used to do it to this. And so I've kind of gone back to the camera method and set up a program that very quickly churns through hundreds and thousands of results. So just kind of having a light that lights up when the button's pressed and looking at the command history on the screen, and then using the program to work out how long it took to get from point A to point B.
I think it's worth saying that you've got a wealth of data on your Twitter profile, including controller comparisons, and there's a lot there for people to digest. But I guess for Street Fighter 6, that answers a lot of big questions. So thank you so much for joining me on this one. It's been amazing to speak to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom.
Again, a huge thank you to Nigel for his help here. Actually, after our chat, Nigel uncovered some more data that explains how the modes work. There's a condition to all of this. Street Fighter 6 doesn't run at this rapid figure, at 57.4 milliseconds on PS5 for example, out of the box. Firstly, it does need to be set to the right mode in the game's menus. And secondly, you'll ideally need a TV with variable refresh rate support, or VRR. It's worth stressing your output resolution also has virtually no bearing on latency here. Also, the performance and resolution modes in Street Fighter 6 have no impact on the arcade mode latency either. That only affects the World Tour segment. With all that in mind then, the key option to note is the input delay reduction mode. As shown in the demo, this toggle triggers 120Hz output from the game on PS5, Series X and S, but keeps the frame rate capped to 60 FPS within that higher refresh container. Let's take PS5 as an example, though this also applies to Series S and X as well. By default, Street Fighter 6 actually runs with an input latency of 98.4 milliseconds on PS5 with IDR disabled. That's the standard out-of-the-box number with no changes made to its settings. 98.4 milliseconds is obviously higher than you'd expect, but of course, if you enable the IDR mode, the situation changes, and the latency drops immediately to 62.3 milliseconds. It's a difference of 36 milliseconds or around 2 frames. However, if you couple this IDR mode with a VRR supporting display, well, that latency number then drops again to the best case 57.4 milliseconds we mentioned earlier. So, the bottom line, Capcom is relying on you to have the hardware, a VRR compatible display, in order to get the best, most responsive controls from the game. With all this being said, for most people I'd wager the difference won't be that perceptible, and as we said in the interview, it's more of a consideration for the competitive scene, where every frame counts. Overall then, Street Fighter VI is a remarkably complete package at launch. It addresses a significant problem with Street Fighter V at its own release way back in 2016, where key features went missing, so much is crammed into its menus, and it truly sets a great foundation for Capcom's future work on the game. Perhaps the best news of all though, it's that input latency is a real consideration this time. We get the tools to adjust the game, with this IDR mode letting us whittle down the milliseconds between input and on-screen response. For competitive players on PS5, Series X and S and PC, no one is left behind. All run with great results in the best case, but be warned, it does take the right hardware to get there. Perhaps the only glaring point about Street Fighter VI right now then relates to the less powerful machines. The Series S version's textures are a rough spot for sure, and meanwhile PS4 and PS4 Pro owners will certainly feel the drop to 30 FPS in its World Tour battling. That aside though, the arcade mode action, the traditional 1v1 gameplay is just as on point as the demo. It's a locked 60 FPS line regardless of your platform, and honestly, for that alone, it puts the Street Fighter series in a very good place. But that's all from me today. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.